panel will be about activism, but I wanted to really frame what is like organising in relation to activism, because I think that there's been quite a big like commodification of activism that is quite separated from what organising really is, and that a lot of people don't understand what organising is. For context, like my background is in like anti-fossil fuel organising, and then currently I do labour and union organising for literary workers around divestment within our industry through fossil-free books. And I also have started up a school for organising, something I'm very passionate about, as you can probably tell. And Kate, I wanted to hear from you first. As a community organiser, could you maybe like define what is organising really? How does it fit into this kind of world of activism more widely? And why do you think that organising is so important?
Yeah, so I think activism and organising share a lot of DNA in that they both come from the foundational understanding that our communities don't look the way that they do by accident, which means that change is not going to happen accidentally. Work needs to be put in, relationships need to be cultivated, and action needs to be identified. And I think one of the things that's unique to organising is that it's a slower relationship-based model that focuses not just on stopping the harm that is occurring, but changing the system, the way that resources are distributed, the people who have a seat at the table to make decisions, so that we can keep that harm from happening again in the future. I think of it as a type of reparations work, actually, or a type of deep repair work, not just alleviating that harm, but modifying the world so that harm doesn't happen again. So the work that I do, which is in 16 cities now, including 3 in Massachusetts, a lot of the work that we do is in working with residents to build their capacity to self-advocate for the long term for a change in access to climate adaptation resources. It's sort of not a mystery what we need to keep people safe from the climate crisis. We're sort of locked into a certain amount of screwed with heat and with flooding and things like that. And the infrastructure that we need exists, and it exists in wealthy neighborhoods, and it exists in whiter neighborhoods. And so what does it look like to take a hard look at the systems and structures? And I think one of the things that tends to scare people off of organising is that they hear the term and they think, I am not ready to like chain myself to a tree, or I am not ready to like lay down in front of the Prime Minister's car and stop them from moving on. But if you have ever showed up to or organised a block party or just like showed up with a bag of chips, then you've taken the first step to participating in organising, because you're connecting with your community and you're learning about people's shared identities, about their priorities, about the things that are important to them. So if you've done that before, you're an organizer. Like, welcome to the club. It's great. And the next step is to start looking for that commonality and that shared sense of purpose, or that shared sense of wanting to intervene and disrupt the way that things are working. And so I think activism can be a little bit more focused on sort of a broader topic and on actions, and it's something that can be a little slow or a little fast, but I think organizing is always a little bit slower and relies on a deeper cultivation of people's connection to one another and their connection to themselves, and an identification of these longer term priorities to keep harm from happening in the long term. So that's sort of how I would like tease apart organizing versus activism.
I think that it's so important because I think there's like a misunderstanding of like how changes ever happened in the past. Like we're deliberately told stories of history or how change happened as if it was just these like incredible, exceptional, heroic individuals who gave great speeches and then people morally decided to change, rather than it's the fact that like millions of people have organised in their communities, didn't see wins, built mycelial networks, as I call it, as you did with your lobbying that you did, that maybe allows for a mushroom to fruit later on, maybe not in that moment. And also that a lot of that organising has been like disrupting the flow of capital and things. It's not just been changing people's minds and making them morally care about things. So I think that understanding history, like as it really was, is really important. But then how is it that we get people to understand that history and then get involved in organising? Well, I don't know if you'd be able to speak to that from your experience.
It's so interesting. I really am so happy that you asked that question and you answered that question for a number of reasons. I think I really identified as, first I'll say this, I really identified as an organizer at the beginning of my climate journey. And to kind of contextualize my journey, a lot of the organizing was as a student organizer with the University of Connecticut at undergrad, and so a lot of the work there was trying to choose a curriculum. A lot of people don't know UConn became the first public university in the country to require everyone to take an environmental literacy course to graduate. And that was because of literally 18 years of people organizing. But when the pandemic happened and I was in the class of 2020 and I was thrust back to my parents' home, I had like the biggest identity crisis because I was like, I'm not an organizer anymore. So how can I continue to do good work because I was about to move to the UK? So I really appreciate that question. As far as how to get folks more involved in organizing, I think the first thing they have to do, particularly in the climate space, I think we're all told to do the same thing all the time, and Google kind of reinforces this. I've Googled it so many times because I'm like, okay, if I wasn't in this space, what would I turn to when I would feel maybe embarrassed about asking someone where to start, or I felt immobilized by the scale of the problem. So I've Googled every type of variation of how to get involved, and every single time the same thing comes up. Vote, donate, lower your carbon footprint, some iteration of that, maybe one or two more things. And yes, do all those things if you so choose to. They're important. But none of the results are going to tell you, like, me as a person with my fingerprint, with my unique skills, talents, my unique spheres of influence, how can I lend a hand to the problems that are uniquely impacting the communities that I'm a part of? And I think that takes a deep look at oneself. And I think it requires us to know ourselves, know what we're good at, what brings us joy. I think those things really have to go hand in hand. Like, you have to like what you're doing too. There's like a Japanese Hagikai, a Japanese like theory that you can create a constellation of possibilities, thinking about the things that you're good at, the things that bring you joy, and the work that he's doing. And Dr. Yana Johnson has crafted a climate Venn diagram out of that principle. And I think that's a really useful tool as a starter. And I would say that finding community in that is really helpful. I'd say what we all want is to find belonging, regardless if we're organizing or not. But particularly when it comes to organizing, that doesn't happen in a silo. There are activists that do sometimes work alone. If you're an organizer, if you're doing organizing, that work is deeply relational. And that actually, I think, manifests in there being more sustainable movements, because if you're working alongside folks, you are accountable to them, which is really beautiful, but then you're also more accountable to yourself. And I think that that's a great starting point. And then also being able to know your community enough to point out the problems, but then also to begin to ideate whatever the issue is could look like in the future when you build a better system. And that requires consultation with oneself, consultation with your community, and that's where like the accountability really comes in. Thinking co-creating.
Yeah, I think those things that you're saying that come up when you search how you get involved, I also think they're quite like deliberately individualized to just try and continue this exact same world as it is, which I think is very disempowering to a lot of people. But in the same way, I didn't identify as an environmentalist for a very long time, and actually started off like my activism journey on the borders of the UK and France, doing kind of mutual aid work for displaced communities, because how the climate crisis had been framed to me was like, let's have this world continue, yay! And I was like, that sucks. Like, there's so much harm and oppression that is faced by the majority of people in this world, and that continuing doesn't make me that excited. What makes me excited is the opportunity to transform everything, and that's what we actually can get with climate action, but not with the individualised climate action, more with the climate action in which connects you to your community, in which you're involved in organising, you're really transforming the systems that have created this world. And I think it's really important that we recognise that we have that opportunity. And what you're saying about connecting to the community, like also, I made the best friends I've ever made in my life through organising. So you have so much to gain from it as well. But we do really need to like bring everyone along with us and on board. And Sierra, you've talked about how you've ended up in like quite conservative spaces in the sports world. And I was just wondering, because I don't think I can do that. I find those spaces really difficult. And I was just wondering if you could offer us any advice on navigating spaces that are maybe like less open to these ideas, and how do you navigate those spaces?
Well, I will say that I definitely did not start here. I assigned myself early to be a very angry activist. the thing that I loved the most, the thing that, helped me survive through life, that gave me my living, that upheld my community, was being ripped away from not just me, but my global community at large. And there was a lot of emotions and grief that I had to work through to arrive at the point that I'm at now, where, to illustrate an example, I recently attended a bipartisan roundtable at the Schwarzenegger Institute, where I noted that my bio listed me as a conservative climate activist. And at first I was like, and then I kind of had this feeling of like pride overwhelm me that was like, wow, I've managed to like chameleon into them thinking that I'm on their side, and then I loved that, because really we're all on the same side when it comes to climate. We're all living on this planet, and I did, take the liberty to clarify that wasn't my personal identification, and we'll clarify this in this room, but I think that there's immense privilege in the position that I have, and I certainly understand why that's not your position, but myself as a light-eyed blonde white woman, I've managed to be able to wiggle into these spaces and places where I can speak to conservatives, I can speak with fossil fuel executives and representatives, and I take a lot of joy in finding common ground in those places and spaces, and landing in the humanity that this crisis is, because I firmly believe we don't have a climate crisis, we have a crisis of humanity, and we're all on different stages of our journey, but I think that everyone is welcome, and to echo some of the sentiments that were shared yesterday of the othering that happens in this movement, I think sometimes as activists we're putting ourselves behind in that, and if we can take an opportunity to call in, I will personally take that opportunity, and I'll say this with like due respect to the whole spectrum of activism and the call out and all the things.
I'd love to like challenge all of you on this, because I think I struggle with, I think there's been more of an issue of climate activism being like refusing to challenge the status quo and refusing to challenge the 1% and caring more about getting them on board when they actually don't care about us or the majority of people. Like, they profit from extracting from people's lives. And I think that we've gained a lot more if we recognise that the crisis that we're facing is the climate crisis is like a symptom of like white supremacy and capitalism that have been like extracting from people for like hundreds of years. Actually, capitalism's not been around that long, so we can create something else. But yeah, I think, how do we ensure that our like movement is actually challenging? I don't know, and it's actually disruptive, and is not going to get consumed or absorbed by the status quo. Because I think I do worry how even our language in these spaces ends up on like billboards for fossil fuel companies, or like and I was at Shell's AGM this week, and the amount of like of our language that they used in their speeches brought me made me so upset and like heartbroken. I was there to speak on behalf of comrades in the Niger Delta where the life expectancy is between 41 and 46 years of age because of Shell's exploitation there. That was younger than most people in the room that day. And I think I just worry about like what we're talking about not being challenging enough if they're able to absorb it. And like how do we navigate that? I was wondering if anyone can have any thoughts on that. Sorry, it's a big question.
I think one of the most powerful parts of good organizing is shared leadership and decision making. And I think taking a really critical eye to the way that others, be they corporations or even municipalities, because I think municipalities actually play this game too. Like the local government does as well, of promising green action or putting together unfunded plans to green a space or to get the city off fossil fuel, but then not fund it or put any work behind it. And so I think using a critical eye in these situations to look for where is there shared leadership and decision making, and where have the people who are most impacted by this been consulted. And so I think that there's a really great, I'm a big believer actually in the hyper-local solutions. I think we need everybody at every level, and that's the perspective that I'm coming from, is that the biggest bang for your buck, that's your municipality. You finding your city councilor, you finding your neighborhoods, because that's also where you have the most authentic knowledge of what the problems are and what the solutions are likely to be. And I think that as much money and time has been put into co-opting these phrases and energies, they've also put a lot of money into making it seem like you don't know what you're talking about as a person, and that your anxiety is not real, or that the grief that you're experiencing is not real, or that your understanding of the problems is not real. And I think that that's like a very, it's an important type of subversion to go in and say, actually, I am a real person, and I know what areas of my community flood, and I know where the air quality is really poor, and start trying to see yourself as someone who's an expert, the same as the scientists who are paid by the Shell Corporation to say whatever, or to see yourself in that space of being a community expert. No one has the knowledge that you have, so no one is able to drive the conversation as authentically. So keeping a critical eye and looking for where shared leadership is not actually occurring, understanding that valuing your own expertise is subversive and is radical. To your point, it's not like that radical, but in our culture it kind of is, to push back against all of this energy and work that's been putting into making you think that the climate crisis is your fault because you don't wash your recyclables super well.
And Wawa, through your work in Black Girl Environmentalists, you championed thousands of Black women in the wider community. You should feel so proud of the work that you're doing, and so many of us are so grateful for that. And through doing that, you've kind of had to have one foot in the kind of more formal activism space, and then one foot in the industry space, through increasing opportunities for Black women and white people to work in the environmental space. And I was just wondering, how do you navigate being in both of those spaces? And do you have any advice for us on how you're able to navigate that without compromising the values or what you're trying to do?
I'll first say I'm still learning, but the first thing I'll say, kind of answering that last question as well, is there is a humanitarian crisis happening in this movement. There's also a narrative crisis. The reason why our language is so honestly easily co-opted is because we haven't had a common understanding of what exactly we're saying. If you think about the terms that we use in the climate space, we're fighting climate change. What does that mean? If you visualize that, we're fighting this cloud. No, there is a group of people, a very small group of people, that are deciding to place profits over the vitality and survival for the rest of us and future generations. And we can call them out. They have names. It's Googleable. We can
they have agency as well. That's something that it's not the default that they decide to do this.
Exactly.
But sorry, continue.
No, and so all those, basically. So I'll end on that point. To answer your question, which I think also goes back into the question that you asked earlier, I think it all comes down to asking ourselves as a collective, who are we accountable to, actually? So as someone in the nonprofit space, very new, I've been in this role for 2 years now, and I've learned a lot about the nonprofit space. And oftentimes the advice that I get is, the number one audience, especially as a small organization. I'll also take a step back. Climate is the most underfunded issue out there, which is insane, because hopefully all of us are recognizing what's going on, and that it's also a lot more costly to be reactive rather than proactive. But youth-led climate organizations receive 0.76% of climate philanthropy. So when you are an organization led by young people, you are less likely to be taken seriously by funders, let alone be considered at all. And because of these paradigms, and also when you bring in the fact that it's a Black-led, youth-led organizations, the numbers get smaller and smaller around how much money has historically been given, period, let alone a yearly percentage. So I get a lot of advice from a lot of people. how to navigate those circumstances. And sometimes the advice is, Wawa, we know what your politics are, your group's politics are, but maybe you should dial it back. Maybe you should just focus. It's like kind of the argument that as environmentalists we might get around like stick to the trees and leave everything out, which is like disingenuous because obviously like the systems that have led us here, we have to name them, call them out, and move ourselves outside of that. But we're often told this, not just myself, but a lot of other youth-led climate organizations, that we need to be holding ourselves accountable to funders and potential funders and thinking about how our narrative should be specifically directed to them. And I understand, obviously, if people are going to give you their dollars, like, first of all, there should be an alignment from the jump. Like, are we on the same page? And that's something that I've had to learn through experience, not necessarily through advice I've gotten. But through that, what myself and my team have decided that number one, our accountability is to our community, first and foremost. So sometimes, something that we might say or the stance that we take, funders may not be okay with that, and we've seen that. I'll be completely honest, we have been dropped by some funders because of our positions, and that is something that we have to be comfortable with because we have to be true to what we're trying to do in this space and the world that we're trying to build. Like, I'm not comfortable putting my name, and I'm so grateful to have a group of people that also believe this, put our name behind like anything that doesn't make us feel comfortable with our values. And I think that the values of our group as a collective, we are held accountable not just to our team, but thousands of members. And I am only going to put ourselves in a situation where their values and what they believe are what the organization prioritizes first and foremost. And then I think also on the participatory justice end of things, as an environmental justice organization, if we say we're EJ focused, then our members should have a role to play in how the programming is put out, how much folks are paid, etc. And that's something that we've really centered from the jump. So before we even create a program, we host a series of town halls, and we ask folks, hey, we have this idea about this program, what do you think? And here's the thing, people will literally tell you exactly what you need. We recently launched a fellowship that places a cohort of early career, so college students, recent graduates, at green organizations for the summer. We, not only they are paid a minimum of $20 an hour, but they receive a $5,000 living wage stipend, they receive professional development, mentorship, and a summer retreat. We really want to invest in folks because we know that Black women have the lowest retention rate of any other demographic in the climate sector, and it's because of lack of investment, lack of support, lack of mentorship. And how did we come up with those numbers? They literally told us. We're like, okay, what is the amount of money that y'all need every hour to feel supported? They're like, this amount. What is the amount that y'all need for your living wage stipend? This amount. What does support actually look like? Like, what type of mentors do you want? What are the questions that you want us to help answer? What are networks that you want us to support you with? These are, our focus is on early career individuals. This program is for, we're going to age it like 18 to 25. And people might say young people don't know what they want, or, maybe it's the young people's problem that they're not getting into these spaces. No, people know exactly what the problems are around pathway and retention. And that's something that we have learned, and the success that we've seen as an organization in having just a month of having the application period open and over 200 people apply, just 7% acceptance rate for a program that a lot of other organizations struggle to even get people to apply, is because our community told us what they wanted, and then they applied for the program that they co-created with us. And so it kind of goes back into this idea of people know what they want, give them the platform to co-create the things that you say are for them, and the work does itself. It's like a cycle.
I think that says a lot about how much power philanthropy is having to shape the world that we get to have. In a similar way that banks shape the world that we have because they choose who to give money to, whoever gets loans, the businesses that exist for longer. I think philanthropy is just having that. I think that there could be a change needed to give more autonomy to the people who are doing that work, and not just redistribution of budget. So there's Bill Gates about a couple of years ago, but not just redistribution of like wealth, but also redistribution of power over the decisions of what wealth being made. And yeah, some good points about that there. And I was talking to Cate at breakfast. I was reading Dykes to Watch Out For. Has anyone read that?
Yeah.
It's great. Okay, there's some laughs. And it's a comic from like the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. It was like in a weekly lesbian newspaper, and it follows a bunch of dykes in, I think it's in Minneapolis, in the Midwest. And we were both talking about how in this comic that is, over 20, 30 years old, they're discussing issues that we're still discussing today, and we're still trying to grapple through today, and we're still trying to work out. And how is it that we're still going through these same issues, and how is it that we haven't solved these problems, or how is it that we haven't learned enough from these issues before? So I was wondering if anyone can respond to this, or we all do it like that. How have you learned from movements that have come before us, and what ways do you think that all of us could try and move us beyond having these same issues and conversations again, to try and solving some of these commonalities that have been going through even the movements for decades now. Everyone looks around.
I'll say that I'm very much still on my journey, and sitting in the seat of humility is really important work for me personally as an activist, as a leader and organizer. And the BLM movement and some organizations like Intersectional Environmentalists and Wawa's organization have been incredibly educational to me and inspiring to me to ensure that the work that I'm doing in this world is intersectional and includes justice at the center of it all, because if your environmental work doesn't include justice, you're contributing to an unjust world. And I'm constantly turning over stones of learning of more injustices and more ways that the climate crisis and environmentalism is connected to human health and poverty and racial injustice. And so I think I'm learning a lot even in this moment, and just feeling really, really, really grateful to be in a state of learning.
I love history. I had actually double major in undergrad in biology and history because I see that as being very closely knit together. I think even there's some really brilliant history out here in Engine and for the rest of America. And I think one of the things that I do in my work to help get through that sort of groundhog state is, because you're totally right. When I read the Dykes to Watch Out For anthology every year, and every year I'm still like, climate change is they talked about it in 1988. What? And how did they? And I feel like I have a 6-year-old. I feel like she's going to say the same thing about the millennial generation. They knew and what? And I think intergenerational conversation is something that's really important, and that's really key to the type of organizing work that I do, is pulling together folks as young as you can get with folks as seasoned as you can get into it, because a lot of the storytelling that we miss out on. I think sort of the dominant American culture is one that doesn't always prioritize storytelling and doesn't always prioritize the lived experience and kind of the everyday person. But it's that everyday person who's been through a systemic injustice, or who has lived through a period of time, or who has seen changes in their community, who has a really good synthesis of what things look like and what sort of patterns to continually look out for as you're organizing. Who to trust, what's the history between this person and that person, what happened in 1960 when they tried to do this and it didn't work, and what lessons can we learn. So I think that while youth-driven movements often change the world in really phenomenal ways, it's also important to knit together the full community and pull together youth and elders, because I think each one informs one another. Young folks come with this sense of criticality, this great sense of right and wrong that is, I think, can be a little bit pure. I think we sort of lose that purity as we get older, and we get a little bit more well, there's shades. Sometimes there's not actually a shade of gray. Sometimes what's wrong is wrong, and we need to listen to the evidence. But I think older folks bring this really great synthesis of what has happened. And in our culture, dominant American culture, I think we do a lot of intentional forgetting. Over time, I think that our municipalities, I think our federal government, I think our corporations put a lot of money into that intentional forgetting, because if we know what happened, if we can learn those lessons from generations and apply them to a world of those generations yet unborn, that power would be far too great. and would completely disrupt the status quo. So intergenerational work, I think, is really key to any progress.
If I can just quickly comment on that, because that really speaks to my part. So we hosted a panel at COP called Intergenerational Female Leadership, which ended up being my favorite moment. We partnered with Black Girl Environmentalist, and one of your very lovely fellows, Victoria Wallen, came to the stage, and her call to action was for other mothering. And that has just stuck with me and sat with me in the most beautiful ways, because I lost my mother 10 years ago, but also I've been able to look back and say how many incredible other mothers that I've had, and also the opportunity for me to step into my matriarchal energy and other mother. And so that intergenerational wisdom and matriarchal wisdom was such a beautiful call out from Victoria.
Oh, I love that term, other mothering. The only thing that I'll add is I completely agree with you. We have this intentional historic amnesia, and it's the most frustrating thing because we all reap the negative outcome of that, no matter where you're coming from. I think we can all say that we can experience levels of frustration, hopelessness, anger, a myriad of different emotions when it comes to climate. And one of the ones that I've been really trying to work through better understanding of social movements that have come before me is feeling like we have to reinvent the wheel, and we really don't need to. When I think about my mentors, I have a lot of mentors that are here, and a lot of my mentors are my ancestors. That's why I have this tattoo that represents my ancestors. It's also the ancestors that maybe aren't my blood kin, but my ancestors of other social movements that have left behind their words that we need so desperately in this moment. And so when I say that we have a narrative crisis, which so many other people say, by the way, so much of what we need is left behind in text, oral history, things that have been passed down, things that we can find from folks in our family, the folks that have other mothered us and our movements. And I think that's really critical. I always think about the civil rights movement for a number of reasons. One, the civil rights movement made it possible for my family to immigrate to the United States. Climate was at the heart of them immigrating. I didn't realize this until I was older and had a conversation with parents like, yeah, there's a drought. We moved to the drought. It's like, damn, I didn't put two and two together. But it was because of the immigration policy wins that happened in the midst of the civil rights movement that allowed for a family like mine to come to the United States. The other reason is because I feel like the youth climate movement is a natural continuation of the civil rights movement. Mikaela, you've talked about this before, but I think what's so interesting is when we think about a movement like Fridays for Future and the way that it really brought together international media and attention to the youth climate movement that again has been around for a really long time, and that moment in time in 2018, 2019 was a huge catalyst for the movement right now, but it certainly was not the first time that young people have walked outside of their classroom in pursuit of a better life. There was the Children's Crusade in 1962 or 1963, St. Baptist Church in the Deep South, where Black youth walked outside of their schools as young as 7, so with 18. The first day they were attacked by the police commissioner at the time with batons, dogs hosed down, and jailed. And the next day, twofold more children came. And it was really a critical point for the civil rights movement. The photos that were taken as storytelling that was depicted in the aftermath really created a lot of international outrage over the plight of the youngest amongst us being treated in such a vile way. And there are a lot of dots that have been connected with the Civil Rights Act being passed, in addition to obviously a lot of other tactics, but that played a huge role in regards to specifically young people and having that visual. And I think that, unfortunately, I think there's a big missed opportunity when it came to talking about the Fridays for Future movement as a natural continuation of the intergenerational legacy that we all are a part of, and this intergenerational thread that really connects us in a really beautiful way. And so I really would advocate for all of you here today that are doing this history, if anyone talks about the Fridays for Future movement, please contextualize that the Children's Crusade is one of several other times in American history, let alone history elsewhere, where young people have had to walk outside of their classrooms or churches, wherever it might be, in pursuit of a better future, and that there are going to be more instances in the future, but we can rely on the histories that have come before us to strengthen us.
Yeah, I love that so much. I recently finished writing a kids' book, which I'm not asked to talk about, but whatever. It comes out next year. We're going around house kids, which is very exciting. And it felt really important in that for the young people to write about how these Fridays for Future strikes are like a historical echo of the Children's Crusades, but also that like Indigenous kids across the world have been forced to take action to rise up against really huge adversity. But again, also the people who were involved in the Children's Crusades, many of them are still alive today. Like and if you look up online, you can read about how they planned that. Like it's really fascinating how they like connected with local radio stations to put out saying that make sure you brush your teeth, kids, was like the code for the kids to know they needed to bring a toothbrush in case they were arrested that day because they were going to walk out that day. And they said we're going to go to the park, we're going to dance or something like that. And that meant okay, today's the day. And they were so organised and yet they're still alive today, people who did that. And there's so many people who are alive today who were involved in incredible transformative organising in the past and in the present. And I do think this intergenerationalness, this connecting with with our ancestors who are alive now and the ones who came before us, is so essential because this isn't the first existential threat that anyone's faced, and we need to engage in that. Before I ask my final question,
I had one thing to
yes,
I think that when we hear about these really big movements, one of the things I want to do is ground us into what you can do and how you can be part of it. I know sometimes when I look at these really big movements, I think gosh, well, I don't have that kind of infrastructure, I don't have that kind of knowledge. But there's a lot of hyper-local organizing that can be done in your community by starting to learn how your hyper-local system functions. So how does your municipality make decisions about how money is spent? How does your municipality make decisions about how tangible resources are distributed, and starting to do things like collect information about your built environment? Noticing things like where do the streets flood in your neighborhood, or which blocks have more trees versus other trees? And is your neighborhood one of the clean green ones among a hill, or is yours one of the ones that's getting some of that exhaust off of the highway? And so to know that organizing happens at all different phases and levels and stages, from global movements to ones that can happen in a 6-block area. And to know that it's really important for you to be a steward and a keeper of the story of your local community, and a steward and a keeper of the data and information of how your system functions, and to start understanding how the local systems work where you are, because they can be intervened in. I think people think of governments as just these unapproachable, just irrefutable forces, and they're not. They're made out of human beings and people and rules, and they can be. So if some of these feel really big to you, take the inspiration from them, but know that you don't necessarily have to imitate the grandness or the scale of it. It's okay to do it really small. And it's okay to actually do it on a small level forever, or to feel empowered to make it a little bit bigger and get involved in larger and global action. Any of those are just better than not doing it.
Yeah, 100%. And also don't give up just because you don't see the wins happening.
Yes.
I feel so nervous to give a mycelium metaphor when there are mycologists in the room. But so apologies for getting this all wrong. But I think I see social change like a lot of people do, and Adrian Marie Brown's work resonates a lot. I'm kind of like mycelium and mushrooms, and how, as we touched on a bit before, but we learn about the mushroom kind of examples, we learn about the actual change that was successful in the campaigns that won. But what allowed that mushroom to fruit is all the invisible networks that happened underground. A lot of them that died because mushrooms so die, grow from death as well. A lot of them that didn't see their success in their lifetimes, but it's only because people didn't give up that those successes, those mushrooms are even possible. So don't give up just because you're not seeing the win now, because your work will be building networks for the win to be seen elsewhere. Okay, and Cate, just before I ask my last question to everyone, do you mind, like you're based in the Massachusetts area, you're organising this area, what can we do to support environmental justice, climate justice in Massachusetts?
Yeah, so the work that I focus on is a lot about climate adaptation as compared to mitigation. I do think we're locked into a certain level of screwed, and we have to deal with it to make sure that people can just survive. And that's my hyper focus, and I'm appreciative of all the sort of mitigation folks. So just so you know that my lens is very much on that adaptation side. And I organize in 3 communities in Massachusetts and then in 25 cities across the country. And I think that there's a lot of commonalities to pay attention to. And that is that, as I mentioned earlier, we know what safe spaces look like. If you've ever been to a neighborhood where the air has felt immediately cooler and cleaner, if it's stayed drier when it rains, if you don't hear the constant rumbling of black carbon spewing diesel trucks coming off the highway if you're a neighborhood, if you're in a space that maybe doesn't have an incinerator located in the middle of a neighborhood, that's the kind of neighborhood that we know exists and know how it works. So if you're here in Massachusetts or wherever you are watching from or listening from or bringing this back to pay attention to the way that our communities look, because they don't look the way they do by accident and they're not going to change by accident. So what you can do is to, if you live in one of those communities that's struggling, to believe in the power of your experience and the fact that what you're seeing is real and it is unfair and it is wrong and it does need to change. And if you're someone who does get to live in a beautiful, clean, green space like this, that it's also part of your human responsibility to other folks to help to advocate, not on behalf of the people in those communities, but to support them as they start to identify the things that they need to change in their community. So for me, I'm very focused on how do we make sure that the resources that we already do have get distributed a little bit more equitably. So doing things like paying attention to your city council's budget cycles and making sure that you get to know the way that the different systems and distribution methods work in your community so that you can start to say, hey, I think we're actually good over here in this really nice neighborhood. Let's turn our attention to this one that's by the highway. And again, not working on behalf of other people, lending your support and the power you have. I'm an elder millennial, and I think that one of the things that when our generation and younger generations talks a lot about the idea of privilege, it's something that can have sort of a negative connotation or a taint to it, but I encourage you folks to also see it as a call to action, that whatever privilege you have is part of your responsibility to leverage that on behalf of others. So if you're someone who comes with education or someone who comes with wealth, with connections, if you're someone who looks like the type of person in decision-making rooms, that privilege can be leveraged on behalf of and in community and in partnership with others. So make sure you're doing that too.
I'm going to ask my last question, but then there's time for all of you to ask questions afterwards. So during this time, I'd encourage you to start thinking. I don't know if there are note cards that have been, I don't know, there's no note cards. So get ready to stand up and do the best performance of a question, but not a statement, please. Thank you. I'd love to end this in like not a flimsy, airy-fairy way, but a very like practical, material way of what is the importance of joy in our movements, and also in this world that we're fighting for. You're making me think about using the terminology in fighting, like how almost like militarized it's become. It's similar in medicine how I'm not going to this world that we are wanting to build, co-creating, whatever the words are. I think we're not just wanting to stop the bad stuff. We want to build good things as well. And we also want a world where everyone gets to experience joy, where everyone gets to live in dignity. I think that's important that we're like prioritizing everyone, it's about redistribution of that. What do you think is the importance of joy? How do we do that? How do we build this world where all of us are well? And Sierra, would you mind beginning?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. What a beautiful question. I think it's not really fair to talk about joy if I can't mention my journey of how I've gotten here, because I do feel very much at this point in my life embodied in joy and able to hold a container for others to experience joy. But to get here was deep grief of understanding that the thing that became my passion, my livelihood, that frankly saved my life, is never going to exist in the same capacity that I got to experience it. And it makes me want to come to tears. There's still some grief there in saying that. And it took a long time for me to stand in that reality and go through my personal process of allowing myself that grief until I felt empowered to do something about it. And now I see joy as my responsibility, because if my mission is to create a positive impact in this world, my work can only be as well as I am well. And so I have to take care of myself. I have to choose love. I have to choose joy. I have to choose optimism, because if I don't, I will sink. And there's so many people out there in this moment that don't have the privilege to choose that. And so when I can, I will.
I'm not going to say too much, but we always say the saying, like joy came out which way?
It's a quote by Rebecca Song that joy does not betray but sustains activism and basic politics that aspires to make you fearful, alienated or isolated. Joy is a fine act of rebellion. As you can see, I said that.
Imagine if every time I had a question like that in my head, like Mikaela's voice came up in my brain. Thank you. I love that quote, even though I couldn't say it right now. I love that quote. And I think the other aspect of that is I don't think our joy should come at the expense of other people. And I think that is something that we all have to unlearn. And that's, I think that goes hand in hand. And very similarly with your journey, I think something that I've had to come to terms with myself is there is no sustainability in any of the work that I'm doing if I can't experience joy. Because what am I going to be 30 years from now, just miserable? And I think one of the things that has been really beautiful as someone that grew up playing a lot of instruments and singing, and I identified more as a musician when I was younger, trying to get back into my childhood loves. But I think something that we're missing so much in this moment is the connection between our movements and music. When we think about civil rights movement, anti-war movement, so many movements like music and musicians so hand in hand, and that is such an obvious experience where joy comes from that, right? And I think that we need more dance parties in our organizing spaces. And what's really cool with Black Girl Environmentalists is that my team and myself, we get to create these spaces that we haven't experienced yet, but want to experiment with. And so we actually have a team retreat happening next month, and we plan on having a big dance party at the end, and hopefully that will be a continuation and reoccurring theme at all of our in-person engagements, just because I think dance and music are just so critical to our happiness.
I love that. Joy dance party. I'm so excited.
I'm excited.
If anyone in the audience is kind of like me and hasn't yet cultivated a full practice of joy, you're not alone. I think I'm still on my journey about building the infrastructure for it. And I think the way that I'm working on building the infrastructure is to be a little bit more in touch with my senses. I think that joy is something that in the dominant culture is something that's not taken seriously, right? Like serious people don't experience joy. Serious people like count their money and I don't know, they go to meetings and stuff and wear suits. And I think that there is a seriousness to cultivating that practice of joy. For at least me personally, it's not something that necessarily has come organic in the face of all of this climate grief. I haven't quite processed all of it yet. It's something I think that was renewed when I had my daughter. In a very deep and unexpected way. And so for me, trying to take the practice of just paying attention very deeply to each one of those senses. What do I need to feel this week? Physically, what do I need to smell this week? What sort of sounds do I want to populate this summer? And so that's the way that I'm starting to build the infrastructure for joy. It allows you to slow down and be a little bit more present in the moment because there's a lot to worry about and there's a lot to ruminate on for what's happened. So how can you be with yourself and honor yourself now?
I love what all of you are saying, because joy's always been a part of movements of social change. Like it's not, and Adrian Grant has this really like quite a lot how we want to make movements you want to move towards. So we don't. If we all look like we're having a rubbish time, how is that useful? So yeah, that's really important. And there's not a lot to add, but I should go to questions for everyone else. So, does anyone have any questions? Yeah, go ahead. Do you mind standing? Is that all right?
Hi folks. So I really appreciate how intergenerational the conversation became, both in terms of rooting us in the civil rights movement, but also bringing in that I so watch out for. And I want to actually shout out an Atlas article that I was reading during a break called "Did Big Green Groups Fumble Their George Floyd Moment?" From this week that roots us not just in 4 years of advocacy, but in 34 years. And of resistance. But the question that I'm grappling with as an advocate, as a teacher, it's so hard. We have these spaces of sort of intergenerational recognition of resistance, but the imagining of the just and transformative future is so hard. And so what do you think about in terms of how to create those intergenerational spaces of imagining, not just of resistance?
What a question.
Wow. I think abolitionists are the folks that know how to do this stuff.
Yes.
Yes, they do.
Absolutely. And like I feel like, again, going back to like the narrative crisis and the fact that we honestly don't spend a lot of time being very specific about what we're building towards, which is very scary because I always think about best case scenario, best case scenario, because best case scenario looks so different for all of us, right? And because there's urgency as it should be, what happens if we do quote unquote win? And now we're looking around at each other. And we look around at the world that's been built, are we all gonna be happy with it? Probably not. And I think like even if we do and should take the time to co-ideate and co-create the world as we are, there needs to be conversation about what exactly does a just future look like. For me, like there's no just future with a carceral state, period. That doesn't exist. There are some people that don't agree with me on that. I think that's a problem. That's a big problem. But yeah, I think abolitionists are folks that we under prioritize in this space and desperately need.
Does anyone else want to?
I think just more spaces like this. Like I'm looking out in this room and I see a lot of different spaces and people, and I had an amazing conversation with someone last night around chemistry, and we ended up linking like the laws of chemistry to the flows of nature, and it deeply has inspired my climate work. And so I'm constantly challenging myself to not migrate towards the folks that look like myself in the room. I had a birthday party 8 years ago, and I looked around and I said, everybody looks like me in this space, and it was they're beautiful, amazing, brilliant people, but it was a huge wake-up call for me. And I feel really proud at this point that I've collected a lot of diverse voices, and we build spaces of building a lot of intentional, brilliant minds from diverse thinking and backgrounds together. So I'm just grateful to be here in this container, because I think we're embodying and living the solution at this moment.
I really like that to build off of those two pieces. I think that I wouldn't consider myself like an artist. I've written a book that's very nonfiction and a little technical. But I think in spaces where you feel most inspired, it's because you're being exposed to other art or other culture, and that sort of stirs something inside of you. And I think that's true in coming up with an active imagination. We do sort of struggle, I think, as a dominant culture with having really radical acts of imagination. That's kind of tough for us sometimes. But exposing yourself to the vision of each individual. So who are those people who are anti-impartial state, and what is their vision for that future, and who are the people that look different from you, and what is that? And if you can gather together enough of those perspectives and to prioritize them and to listen to them, I think it stirs something in everyone. I was surprised at how much I was able to connect to when Patty was talking about just like mushrooms underground. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I've ever, compared myself to a fungal network, but that inspired and stirred something in me to think about the world a little bit different and to kind of ratchet up my personal consciousness a little bit. So I think that diversity, Sarah, to your point, is an important part of helping to create the raw materials for imagination.
Mm-hmm. If I'm allowed to add something really brief, just jumping onto that. I just think that like what is possible is the direct conclusion of what we all believe is possible and therefore create. And I think we should let the status quo and the establishment limit what we believe is possible, because so much more, and everything that's ever happened in history has been looked at as impossible or ridiculous before it's actually happened. Then afterwards, history rewrites it as if everyone knew it was going to happen and it was inevitable. So much more is possible than we might think is, but we have to believe in that, and we have to imagine that, and we have to include other people's perspectives, as you're all saying, in order to achieve that. Next question.
I have one.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the morning after 2001, when September 11th happened, I had an exhibit on the Cape, and I extracted 2 lines that were already in the exhibit and enlarged them in a 30 by 40 frame. And one is a question that I wrote to begin a poetry festival, writing exercise. Has the time arrived when humanity is able to digest the remarkable reality of just how simple it could be to shift the Earth's vibration? And then another thought that was already in the exhibit, I enlarged in 30 by 40 frame, is shared about the French philosopher who I learned about 20 years before. He created the word noosphere to describe a layer of thought that hovers above nature and acts as universal consciousness. It's what people think is the one mind or the collective consciousness. Jourdain actually felt that our thoughts go up to an energy field and they're reflected back. So that's when I come up with a philosophy that if enough people could simply quiet their thinking for a few minutes daily, I really think it's what's the crisis on the planet. It's what's causing the weather patterns, the critical weather patterns. It's just reflected back. And if Chardin's philosophy is accurate and true, then if enough people could quiet their thinking just for a few minutes daily, it would quiet that noosphere around the planet. And it could be a formula for global peace and healing even the anti-terrorist attacks. And when people quiet their minds, one gets insights. So there could be insights to cure whatever we need to have cured. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction. Does anyone else have a question? Yeah,
I guess I was wondering, something I've had a really hard time with entering climate activism spaces is I find climate tends to attract a certain kind of person who has like a lot of superiority and nihilism and sort of a very puritanical, it's like a hangover from 20 years ago when there was a lot of, puritanical sort of thinking and shame-based stuff. And I find it very difficult sometimes to go to a meeting and then kind of experience a lot of that shaming energy. And, I've had a really hard time navigating, especially too, it's like if you go out in public and you say climate, those people come to you and start ranting at you about all of their nihilist thinking. And I'm like, how have you guys survived being in climate and building such beautiful, joyous worlds, navigating, how do you navigate that energy, which unfortunately climate tends to attract?
Oh no, I know exactly the person. Yes, so you got a profile. I think for me, it's focusing on the people-centeredness of it. I think so. Just as like a sort of a parallel example. So I'm Afro-Caribbean, and I used to straighten my hair with chemical relaxers. And when I stopped doing that, I went on like a crusade of just like, no one should do it. Here's the reasons why I saw terrible. And it completely ignored the individual power of people to make choices for themselves. I was ignoring the human over what I thought was some sort of a process that I connected to. And I account that, or sort of, I think that in these situations where someone is awakened to something new, they've got this sort of fervor of a convert or this deep understanding that they feel like no one has that has a sort of deep sense of sort of has a sense of maturity to it. And they forget about the human being, and staying people-centered is something that's really important to me. Like, I think all of the nature and all of the components, like, we're part of this ecosystem and we do need to care about it. But for me, it's really caring a lot about the individual people and what does it look like for someone who has to get up in the morning and go to work hot and work a job outside that's hot and then take the bus home hot and then sleep in an apartment that's hot. And what is their life like? And keeping focus on that and sort of rejecting the shame that comes from me, maybe not knowing all of the things or being connected to all of those different people, but keeping my North Star personally focused on the human experience and what is it like to be people-centered in this moment.
Either of you want to respond as well?
You could just go ahead.
Oh no, I just said.
I think I'm trying to just meet people where they're at and accept them and love them for where they're at. My dad loves Trump, and he called me. He called me a few months ago. He only called me a couple times a year, and I decided to answer at this occasion. And he goes, "Did you know that I'm a feminist?" And I said, "No, Dad, I had no idea. Do enlighten me." And he told me, he was like, "Well, yeah, I thought, like, you know, to be a feminist, you had to hate men, and you were angry, and you wanted to be superior to men. But now I know. It just means that you think men and women are equal. And so now I know I'm a feminist. Okay, gotta go." And that was just like such beautiful growth. And that's where I want to meet my dad. That's like the highest version of my dad, and like celebrating him in that moment. And I won't say it's easy to meet people with love and see the highest version of themselves and meet them where they're at, but it's what I'm trying to get.
Do you want to add anything, Wawa?
I was saying that you can answer the
I can answer. Am I allowed to?
Yeah.
Yeah, keep on. Yeah, Willow's gonna drag me. I think there's a big difference between the like climate emissions space and the like climate reparations like people space, anti-extractivism space. And I found there's a big difference in the people that end up in either spaces. I spend most of my time in the climate reparations like against extractivism space. I think why that's also really important is because then you understand that like green capitalism is also not the solution, because like more extractivism that causes more harm against communities is also not the solution. Whereas I think the emissions people would be quite okay with this world as it is right now continuing, but just not producing emissions that are causing the climate crisis. But I think recognising there's always been a human crisis, so there are very like material impacts happening against impacted communities, like for example in the Niger Delta by Shell, or in Colombia at the El Salvador mine, which is 6 times, or bigger than 6 times, so it's bigger than Paris as a city, and the YU and the indigenous communities have been having over 40 children per year dying because of being poisoned by that. I think when you're connected to the like, human impacts of this crisis, you can't have this like massive ego, I don't think, or this like nihilism, because it's absurd in the face of the communities that have been in those spaces for so long, I think, to have that. And so I think just choosing to be in those spaces is how I'm like ditched from a lot of those other people. But yeah, I think it's good for people who can have space for those people, I think it's important too. And there's a chapter in my book called You Don't Know What You Don't Know, which is about like creating space for people to change their mind, and because the world that we're wanting to build is dependent on literally millions, if not billions of people being allowed the space to grow in the dignity of their own journeys and changing their minds, and therefore we have to like allow for space for that.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything more, or should we? Do we have time for one more question?
You also don't have to be agreeable to this.
Yeah. Boundaries also. Boundaries.
You can be the thorn in their side.
Okay, so I really like that, you know, the panel to me is very youthful, and I was a climate activist in my community, and I started this, it was part of South Shore Climate Action, but it was Sustainable Marshfield. And we found that like the people that did the most activism in our town were these two like retired women, and they did the plastic bag, they did this energy contract, and it very focused more right on the substance. That I love the concept of people first, and the way you integrate your different areas. And my question, I guess, is how, like, I found when I left Sustainable Marshfield, I left it in charge of this like young kind of couple that I thought would run with it, and it just disintegrated. And there's a lot of burnout in like my age kind of organization communities. Like, you go to meetings and nothing, it's the same 2 or 3 people. And so I love the idea of the energy you're bringing and how to bridge this generation gap, right? Of bringing people that have more time, that aren't having kids and jobs and, maybe retired, and how we can come together better and work together somehow.
Wow, do you want, because I feel like we were talking about this earlier today, and you're gonna be like,
It's like very, like the thought hasn't been constructed fully, so
yeah, I can give you some time to constructively, like,
I'll just ramble for a second. I'm a yapper, but this doesn't answer your question. But Mikaela and I were talking about this morning around, so Black Girl Environmentalists, we are, if anyone knows the Hive Fund, they are a grantor that works at the intersections of gender and climate, and the majority of their grantees are organizations that are run by women of color, and their focus areas in the Gulf South. And we have been blessed to become one of their grantees. We have a hub in New Orleans, and we are expanding our work there, largely because of conversations that we had. We hosted a talk at Essence Fest last July, and it was an opportunity for us to engage with a lot of the intergenerational leaders that are and have been working in the midst of Cancer Alley for the past 40 plus years. And just a couple months ago, I went back to the area because a lot of people don't know this huge climate win that we haven't fully appreciated / celebrated. On January 26th of this year, President Biden agreed to put a pause on the expansion of LNG gas terminals, which is huge because there's currently plans to build out LNG gas terminals and fossil fuel infrastructure in an already fossil fuel heavy area that's quite literally called the petrochemical corridor and Cancer Alley, because it is, just go there. But I went, and what should have been a big celebration, it certainly was me sitting there and being simultaneously heartbroken, because what we were all witnessing was families, intergenerational families, great-grandmothers to grandchildren as old as 99 to like babies that just brand new, talking about fighting against the petrochemical industry as young as 9 years old to now in their 90s. And I was sitting there and I was like, oh my goodness, is this what my future looks like? Not in belittling the greatness of women coming together and fighting these industries and experiencing all these wins, but where does rest come into this? It was seeing multi-generations of families saying the same thing, fighting for their future and the future of quite literally their kin who are brand new. And I was like, what are we doing as a movement? What am I doing as a person in this movement to support our elders that have been doing this for so long? And what infrastructures of care and support are we putting in place now to set our movement up for success, to where when we are at that point, we have created a system where we can be cared for by whoever it might be, the youth, our fellow elders, whatever it might be. And I think there's a lot of anxiety around young people in this work, because I asked Mikaela, I was like, something that I walked away from that situation was, I have all these brilliant women in my life that have nurtured me, other mothers, my own mother, my grandmother, and I have never seen them actually rest. Like actually rest. And I was like, oh, do you have an example of like another Black woman in your life that is, you know, as like in their old age that has been able to rest? She was like, no. And I was like, me either. And I think there's a lot of anxiety around knowing the how long we can continue the energy, and it's difficult when there aren't systems of care and support that are providing us a proof of concept. I don't know what that looks like. Maybe that is like creating retirement funds for activists. I don't know what that. Yeah, we're like, yeah, okay, I'll stop talking. This is like what we were talking about this morning, but I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad we're touching on this because the need for support is so critical. And I think that there's like a weird illusion that's happening right now where people just see all of these activists that are so dedicated to doing all this work as these like just characters, but the reality is like the mental health breakdowns, the physical health breakdowns, like debt, like you know, like I won't go into my personal story of how I've been able to make things, but it's not pretty on the back end. Like, you know, some of us do come from resources, but that's the few of us. And so I'm so, Wawa, what you're doing with Black Girl Environmentalists and the grants you're seeing, I saw that and I was just like so proud of you and the space that you're creating. So beautiful. And my organization has launched a philanthropic arm, Better Earth, and our mission is to directly fund youth and Indigenous activists to tell stories. And we've already released micro grants to send activists to COP, to be present in those spaces, to do their work, to tell the stories that they're already telling, but get paid to do them, to align them with like value-aligned brand. There has to be financial resources that are flowing to frontline activists, because we are tired. And when we're trying to like figure out where we're paying our bills or how we're paying for our healthcare, it's distracting from the work. And so I just want to share that to this room. And not everyone has financial resources to share, but things like, you know, being clothed or being fed, or shout out to Atmos for the support that they have given all of us for being here. I feel like a queen being supported in this way. Like truly, thank you. Sorry if that was a rant.
That's great. That's an important one, because the movement, this is another way in which capitalism is subsidized off of the back of other people. We see this in countless forms, but the burnout's really high, and the way that we are expected to move through this and sort of carry that joy without actually having a good model for what it looks like to rest. Like that's something that I'm working on too with building infrastructure for joy, is figuring out like what does rest really look like. And I think especially for queer activists, for activists of color, like there's an inherent risk to resting. Like there's a reason why I think our people here have never rested, or we at least have the perception that it puts us at a degree of greater vulnerability. So I think taking an intersectional lens to what it looks like to effectively rest, to create spaces for rest, to reduce the consequences for rest. I think that's like very radical and subversive thinking, right? Like capitalism does not want us to slow down, to calm our minds.
And I think like those of us who maybe are able to rest more or feel more rested, like how can we create that space for others? So for example, in Fossil Free Books that I'm part of, we had like a strategy day, and I'm not a parent, but lots of people who organise with us are. And so I was like, I'm more rested than the parents who are organising with us. I can do childcare for that day and like take that on with not just in my own, obviously, but we try to do it in that framework of like how is it that we can redistribute that rest to other people. And I think as well, it's the reason why a lot of us overwork is because there aren't the people who are doing work with us.
Yeah.
So I'd like less people to call us inspirational and more people to join us. On that note, can we do a massive round of applause for our incredible panelists?